Hi, I'm Ludic. Today I'd like to talk about narrative intensity in the games of Deconstructeam, Gods Will Be Watching and the Red Strings Club. Both games are stylish and well written, but the former is a narratively stressful game to play through, and that very feeling is fascinating to consider. Whilst different in their aesthetic themes, the two titles share an interest in confronting players with ethical questions, which is at the heart of their narrative concerns. Both Gods Will Be Watching and the Red Strings Club have different ways of approaching these questions, which is critical to understanding the idea of narrative intensity within them. First, I'll briefly discuss how Gods Will Be Watching constructs almost paralysing levels of narrative intensity through set pieces. Then I'll discuss the ethical dilemmas it forces players to consider in their choices. I'll then contrast that with the careful flow and pace of the Red Strings Club. Before we set off, Deconstructeam are doing some of the most interesting narrative work in games right now, and you should definitely try these games out. I will go over some spoiler territory, so you have been warned. Gods Will Be Watching is self-advertised as a point-and-click thriller, and whilst that may seem a paradoxical combination, it is no word of a lie. The game is separated into 7 distinct levels or chapters. At the start of each chapter, a situation is explained, the objective is communicated, and the ways the player can interact are laid out. It is a time-based interaction system. By this I mean that every time a player makes a choice or confirms a set of actions, time moves forward in some way. This can be represented as security forces advancing on the player's position, or as a countdown timer for oxygen supply. The game takes place in a carefully crafted ecosystem of consequences. Not only that, but these choices put players in dubious moral positions. For example, do you sacrifice someone with an injury because they are jeopardizing the survival of everyone else? Because of these carefully crafted ecosystems of consequence, progression forward through the game resembles the unravelling of a narrative puzzle. However, this game structure does not come without controversy. In the original difficulty setting, the game can be punishing, one wrong choice requiring the entire chapter to be restarted, and some of these consequences come through random factors, making it feel unfair. The game has since been updated with options which lessen RNG and make the game easier to progress through. Across the 7 chapters of Gods Will Be Watching, the player is placed within a narrative frame of intense conflict, either between characters or with environmental factors. These range from hostage situations to viral outbreaks to wilderness survival, where all the elements are against the player. In these levels, the player is not placed within a conversation between two characters or in a position where they explore an environment. The player is positioned at a point where forces are coming into direct conflict, where the stakes are at their highest. Each chapter puts characters in situations where their lives and the lives of everyone else around them are directly at stake. Whilst dramatic conversations can be intense, and for details see the work of Aaron Sorkin, the consequences rarely involve the lives of the participants. Gods Will Be Watching also contains very little exposition in the build-up to these levels. There is a narrative setup for why the events are happening, and there is an explanation of what the situation is, but there is no 1-hour build-up that we might expect from other media. The game relies on the intensity of the set piece itself to establish the tone of the level. Most of these set pieces involve the competing interests of characters who are prepared to do anything to meet their goals. The player is placed in a fulcrum position of how to resolve conflict at its most volatile. That these set pieces are naturally intense does not describe the position each character is placed in, however. The game simulates the idea of people being pushed to their breaking point. The animation of each character communicates their mental health state, which increasingly mounts the pressure on the player, who must balance these emotional states. Gods Will Be Watching doesn't just deal with the abstract idea of lives in the balance, but it visually communicates that on an individual basis. To balance these systems, the player is confronted with possible actions they can take which are immoral. Should the player threaten a hostage so they do not try to escape? Should the player test a potentially deadly cure for a virus on a dog? Making these choices is stressful. It makes the player confront the moral guidelines they have followed in their own lives. Progression is not necessarily tied to taking these options, but with these ecosystems of consequence, they can help progress. These ethical dilemmas are at the heart of an already intense narrative context. They add more conflict to an already intense set piece. Without the injured soldier in Chapter 5, some of the conflict is lifted from the troops' struggle across the desert. Without the dog in Chapter 3, the player is not confronted with the idea of engaging in animal testing. Though increasingly stressful, these added ethical conflicts contribute to a fascinatingly intense experience. On the other hand, the Red Strings Club is a cyberpunk narrative game where players unravel a corporate conspiracy. Players take on the role of several characters, advancing the story through dialogue and a few other activities such as bartending and pottery minigames. Progression through the game is mostly guaranteed as conversation flows naturally forward. Any negative consequences of an action are folded into the branching narrative of the game. The player mostly experiences the game through the bartender Donovan, who operates as an information broker, finding out information from key personnel within the corporation at the heart of all of this intrigue. Donovan serves drinks to these employees and engages in conversation about their work. Information crucial to the plot is slowly revealed, and the implications of what the corporation is doing builds. The Red Strings Club also confronts the player with moral quandaries, but in a more subtle, reflective way. The minigames are used within the narrative to alter the disposition of NPCs so information can be gleaned from them. The player is then asked whether these actions in any way mirror those of the corporations they seek to halt, shining a light on the grey area the player seems to operate in. From its soundtrack to the flow of conversation, the Red Strings Club operates on a completely different level of pace to Gods Will Be Watching. The former operates on a steady rise in tension as the plot thickens, and the latter deals in spikes of intensity as the player moves from chapter to chapter. Obviously, the narrative of Gods Will Be Watching does not take place in a ludic vacuum. The game systems and other aesthetic elements are just as important. Whilst this video isn't about the ludic elements, it is worth noting something that point-and-click games can do in contrast to other games that is quite interesting. The lack of direct one-to-one control over the player character changes the nature of choice and consequence, in contrast to something like Battlefield, where most of the interaction system is geared towards killing. There is always a choice in Gods Will Be Watching to not kill, and it is always a viable option. Because the interaction systems in point-and-click adventure games offer so many possible choices, there is always a feeling that you can argue a different way or come up with a different solution. There is no button map to shoot in Gods Will Be Watching, only a button to present a list of choices. Narrative context is so important to a story, but it is still only a fragment of the stressful collage built by Deconstructeam for Gods Will Be Watching. The game balances these ecosystems of consequence, the writing is engaging, and the soundtrack creates a pulse to this intensity. With such a variety of narrative structures being explored in games right now, Gods Will Be Watching is certainly an experimental one, and feels altogether different from anything else. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to watch my last video on ludic intensity in Jotun, then click on the link in the video. To be notified for when my next video drops, then click on the subscribe button, and I also stream game design on Sundays, and you can join me at 7:30 PM GMT at the link below.